running battle. As Christ journeyed through Judea, they would spring one ambush after another. Jesus and the religious authorities of his day with deadly adversaries. What was it? What was the bone of contention, the burr under their saddles, that could lead the leaders of the law to lynching? Can their conflict be clearly captured in a sentence? Fortunately, yes, it can. The religious leaders insisted on the letter of the law. Christ spotlighted the spirit. They worshiped the appearance of things. Jesus served the heart of the matter. They reverenced the rules. Christ referred to the reason for the rules. Perhaps it is all summed up by 1 Samuel in his 16th chapter. The Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. The authorities saw Jesus as incorrigible. He healed on the Sabbath. He failed to follow the manual for hand washing before eating. He treated Samaritans with respect. He spoke to women as if they were his human equals. At a time when the old Orthodox Jew had a prayer they often recited that went, "Lord, I thank thee that I was not born a woman." And that may say it all. He included outcasts as okay. They were working hard for an orderly society above all else, one in which everyone knew his place and stayed in it, and Christ was messing it all up. He was consistent, they'd give him that. He spoke and acted as if people, individual, men, women, and children, really mattered in the eyes of God, as if the fate of human beings was more important than all else to God. Well, they knew there were rules to follow, ways in which things had to be done, and if he was going to make trouble, they had their ways to take care of that and him. The conflict between the letter and the spirit must be fought in every generation. The clash over appearance versus essence is never really once and for all one. It blew up a few years ago in Natick, Massachusetts. Natick is a big town, small city, closer to Worcester than Boston. Jennifer Richardson and her family make their home there. Jenny was 5 years old, and her mom had enrolled her in the religious education program at St. Patrick's Church, where Jenny and both of her siblings had been baptized. The church's education program would soon lead to her first communion. However, Jenny suffers from celiac disease, which produces an intolerance for gluten, a protein found in wheat, barley, oats, and rice. If Jenny eats anything with gluten in it, her stomach swells, her hair begins to fall out, and she starts losing the muscle in her arms and legs, and she becomes sick to her stomach. As a result, she cannot have cookies, pancakes, pizza, cereal, or sub sandwiches. Jenny's mother has to make most of her food at home. Instead of wheat flour, she substitutes rice, tapioca, or potato flour. So Mrs. Richardson arranged a meeting with the priest at St. Patrick's to explain that Jenny would be medically unable to ingest the normal wheat wafer offered during communion. She wanted to plan with the priest for the substitute of a rice-based wafer so that her daughter could participate with the other children. The priest's answer was brief and blunt. He informed Mrs. Richardson that a non-wheat wafer was absolutely impermissible, and there was nothing he could do for her. He did, however, send on her request to the cardinal, the head of the Archdiocese of Boston. The Richardsons later received the cardinal's letter in which he explained, quote, "The law of the Church is extremely explicit. In keeping with the Last Supper narrative found in the Gospels, the bread must be made only from wheat." Case closed? Not quite. The family went over to the local Methodist church and explained their problem. The Methodist pastor visited with the Richardsons in their home and assured them that his congregation would be glad to make sure Jenny would be included in communion with their church. The whole Methodist church was so welcoming that the Richardsons now consider that congregation their church home. In fact and fairness, many Catholic bishops have implored the Vatican to address this issue, and the Richardsons did learn of 2 Catholic churches elsewhere around Boston where the priests do make an accommodation. But they were some distance away. The Methodist church that welcomed Jenny had been Jenny's father's church when he was growing up. When I was in my early teens, church attendance was far more popular than it is today. And when showing up for worship, men invariably wore jackets and ties, if not suits. Women wore dresses, hats, and a bit before my time, at certain times of the year, white gloves. If a woman entered the sanctuary wearing slacks, she'd be the subject of gossip all the rest of the week. If a man showed up in blue jeans, he might have been asked to leave in some churches. Today, if only we could fill our pews with 20 or 30 more worshipers wearing shorts, slacks, or jeans, we'd be deeply grateful and delighted. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Were we really so superficial back then to believe that God would reject worship if the worshiper prayed and sang minus a tie or wearing slacks? During the late 1960s and into the 1970s, I recall conflict and controversy over high school-aged boys with long hair. And having been a teacher in those days at a suburb of Boston, I was right in the middle of it. Some of the boys had hair down over their shoulders in those days. A notable case involved all-star baseball manager George Sparky Anderson, who led the Cincinnati and Detroit teams to World Series championships. He was a great manager, and he was a stickler for rules with all of his players. At home, Sparky's teenage son Lee wore his hair quite long. Sparky ordered Lee to cut it short. Lee refused. The two stopped speaking to each other. They did not share a word of conversation, father and son, for a full year. After his retirement, Sparky devoted most of his time to his family. Sparky and Lee had a full reconciliation. Sparky ended up regretting all the time that he had to be away from home due to baseball, championships or not. Today, Lee Anderson is a successful contractor and known as a man of real integrity. At age 52, he still wears his hair at below shoulder length. More recently, the fashion has included tattoos, and nose, eyebrow, and lip rings. I don't get it. I just don't. Their fashion tastes make no sense to me at all. But their character and trustworthiness runs the gamut. Their integrity is not determined by a tattoo or a nose ring. Now, suppose a future candidate for pastor of this church was a young woman who struck you as a wonderfully qualified, ideal candidate. She would come highly recommended by her previous church, and they were very sad to see her leave. She was known as an outstanding preacher and a very compassionate counselor. Let's assume her neckline and skirt length was perfectly proper. But let's also assume that she happened to have a large, visible tattoo on one side of her neck. What then? Could this congregation see past her visible tattoo and secure the pastoral leadership that she would have offered? Suppose in addition to the tattoo, she was a bleached blonde with a nose ring, but still a compassionate and effective pastor. I'll just leave that unanswered. I think you get the point. I had a marvelous experience yesterday that I want to share with you. I didn't plan on including this, but it's far too good not to. The business of not judging on appearance. I'm part of an association in my home city, the city of Lynn, half an hour's drive north of Boston, city of about 100,000. I work on a project down there with some others. I'm part of what's called the Friends of Lynn Woods. Parenthetically, may I ask you, at to close the service, not to recite the poem for me, Lynn, Lynn, the city of sin. You never come out the way you went in. I've heard that on these parts plenty enough already. Now, I was down there working in an area of the playground, and which I've been doing. I go down about once a month. Adjacent to where I was working is a basketball court. While I was working, 3 or 4 kids happened to show up with a basketball. They were black and Hispanic, which is a little unusual. The neighborhood has changed, but not that much. It always was quite white. Well, they began playing basketball with exuberance. I could overhear some of the conversation, but it was mainly in Spanish. Fine. Pretty soon, 3 or 4 more show up, and they're black and Hispanic. And finally, the total reached about 15 kids, one of whom looked to be in his mid-20s. Now, I consider myself pretty liberal, pretty socially with it. But I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. I read the paper, I listen to the news, and I'm aware of high crime rate among many blacks and Hispanics. So I looked at these kids, 15 of them, and realized that there's many more of them than me, and I couldn't outrun any of them at my age. So I was just a bit concerned. They continued to play ball. They didn't bother me. I left and went for lunch, came back, and I thought, uh-oh, they're still here. I made sure I didn't leave my tools behind. I put them back in the car so that they wouldn't get stolen. And I took a look at these kids, and then I began to notice something strange. They all gathered in a tight circle. And one of them, the fellow who was in his mid-20s, was speaking softly. I couldn't understand what he was saying. I think it was English, but it was not loud enough to be heard. And then I noticed that they were all looking down at the ground, which I thought was pretty strange. Finally, it dawned on me, they weren't looking at the ground. They had their heads bowed. And the fellow in the middle was offering a prayer. So I was just astonished. He finished his prayer, they all applauded and gave a cheer and began to separate a bit. I couldn't help myself. I went up onto the basketball court, went up to the fellow and said, "Excuse me, was this group just praying?" He said, "Oh yes, yes." He said, "This is the youth group from the Hispanic church, about a half mile that way. These kids are on the church basketball team, and they're in a league with other churches. And we come up here every Saturday to practice." Now, I happen to know about the church. It's all in Spanish. And he said, we're going to add a Saturday afternoon English service, and you're very welcome to attend. I was astonished. And I said how impressed I was, that I was also a pastor. I think I told him I would mention them with you today. I'll just conclude by saying I learned a lesson right there in my old neighborhood, one that I won't forget. Man does look on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Be it color of skin, long hair, tattoos, nose rings, whatever. Amen.